So, James McGrath, it's great to be back with you because we just finished recording an episode on your book, John of History, Baptist of Faith, which is fantastic. But one of the things that you've blogged a little bit about, and you just let it slip that you're writing a book about, so now I know that you're the person I need to ask about this, is the question of deconstruction. It's a question that's on everybody's lips. And I've made some videos talking about how I still identify as a Christian, and people don't seem to like that. They kind of want you to say, like, either you're an atheist and it's just all crap and you have no use for religion of any kind, or, understandably, some people who have been taught to think about what being a Christian means in a certain way push back when you don't necessarily fit their articulation of it. But we have this movement that's now has a name, Deconstruction, and it's this mass movement of people trying to negotiate their relationship to faith. So I'd be curious. You blogged about it, you've talked about it, and I think we share a lot of the same thoughts about it. But what are you thinking about this deconstruction thing, and where are you at with it?
Yeah. So you mentioned a book. When I finished working on the John the Baptist project, I was like, okay, I finally finished a major thing. I'm happy with it. I still have a bit of time, and I was like, it just feels like a relief, a breath of fresh air to not even be thinking about what my next book project might be. So checked in with my editor at Erdman's, and inevitably, I said, yeah, it's good to not have anything specific. Eventually, one of the things I was thinking of was this, and mentioned this idea about a book that initially was going to be titled Reconstructing Your Faith, but now is actually has the title Beyond Deconstruction. He let it slip to the other editors who were like, oh, yeah, we think that would be a really good idea. So I said, well, why don't I, there's still some time before the start of the academic year. Why don't I see if I can churn out a sample chapter? So, ran it by my wife, who recognized that this was the most personal thing I'd written yet. Yeah. Ran it by my son, who said, Dad, you wrote something I might actually read. And so that's when I was like, okay, I'm committed to this. And so actually, in the period right before the last of my bit of sabbatical free time was gone, produced a book that will be out in February, and the title will be Beyond Deconstruction. And the reason for writing it is that academics who go into biblical studies often do so because of their faith, and that faith often includes an emphasis on the Bible, together with some assertions about what the Bible is and what it does and how it should be used, that are challenged directly by close attention to the Bible, which is what you do in academic biblical study. And so this thing that has become more widely known and is getting broader attention of deconstruction is something that academics in biblical studies have been going through for as long as there has been academic study of the Bible.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I think that more of us who are in this field and who've gone on this path and who've come out the other end with some sort of faith, some sort of spirituality, some sort of religious tradition intact, even if it's revised, should tell that story, should offer some thoughts and guidelines, or at least some personal anecdotes about how that can look, and how to think about these things, and what role the Bible can play in a faith that thinks about the Bible differently. When you add to that academics like myself, it may be that something that I have said or done or written about the Bible publicly has actually caused somebody to sort of start on this journey. Yeah. And so the fact that you may, as an academic, also be setting others along this path is, I think, another reason why we owe it to people to say, here are the options. And I agree with you. I think that's really important. The idea that the only options you have are like fundamentalist Christianity and atheism is just so unhelpful, right? I mean, there are multiple variations of atheism, to never mind Christianity. But yeah, the major turning point for me in a lot of ways was reading a wonderful book by the Oxford philosopher Keith Ward.
Okay.
And he mostly writes things about, sort of philosophical matters, things that we might call theology, something with the soul, ideas of God. But he wrote a book called What the Bible Really Teaches, and the subtitle is something like, "And Why Fundamentalists Get It Wrong." And it was just his way of putting things that made me realize that I didn't need to apologize for the kind of Christianity that I have now. Right? So for a while, often after you work through these things, you're like, well, I'm still a Christian. I just don't think or stuff like that. And he just is, sort of no holds barred, is going straight for the fundamentalists and saying, they're claiming to be consistent. They're claiming to take the Bible as the authority, but they are never doing that consistently, right? There are no consistent biblical literalists. There are no people who, it's like, if the Bible says it, I believe in that settles it. Because whenever the Bible says something that they just, it doesn't fit this other thing that they think the Bible says, for instance, right? That's a major one. Then, well, that must mean something else.
Yeah, we're always interpreting.
Yeah. And so that shifted me from being like, basically giving the fundamentalist Christian sort of the high ground and saying they're sort of the default, and I'm a weaker version, sort of a backsliding version of that, or whatever you might want to say. In fact, they have never been, authorized by anyone, from Jesus through Paul to the creeds. No one has authorized that perspective to speak on behalf of Christianity, to define what Christianity is for everyone. And there have always been other forms of Christianity. And so I've shifted from apologizing and saying, well, I'm still a Christian, or I'm a Christian, but to saying, they should be the ones who are adding the qualifiers, right? I'm a Jesus follower who actually is not willing to love my neighbors if they disagree with me on theology, or things like that, that should be, that should have a qualifier every bit as much as, or maybe more than some of the things that we add qualifiers to, like liberal, progressive, or moderate, or whatever else.
Were you raised in like a sort of evangelical or fundamentalist house, or what was that? What was your journey, I guess?
Yeah. So I was raised Catholic, and grew up going to church. Went through confirmation classes, and my confirmation was sort of a turning point in my just feeling disillusioned, because there was a lot of talk about this is sort of your kind of decisive moment, and receiving the Spirit and various other things that were mentioned, and I didn't feel any different, and thought that I should. You're right, if this is something important and spiritual, and so entered something of like a seeker phase, and that in turn led me to discover what I guess the contemporary label is contemporary Christian music. This is in the 80s. There was a college radio station. I used to just flip through channels because I was a music lover, and see what's on and see what I find. And there's a college station that had Christian music, I think 1 hour a week on Sunday or something like that. But it sounded different than what I'd listening to, but also sounded like the kinds of things that I like. And there were people singing about their faith in a way that seemed sort of authentic and real to me, that was different from my experience thus far. And so I started trying to write songs, but they didn't get very far, because I didn't have that sort of profound sort of experience that was emerging out of. But had a friend who was also with me and also into music and exploring in the same way. And then a friend of ours, I think we actually asked her if she wanted to be in a Christian band with us, and she was like, these guys aren't even Christians. Right? So she invited us to church, to a concert at her church. It was a Pentecostal church. Yeah. And there too, at the concert, just the way that the band was singing about their faith and singing to God, I was in tears, and led to me coming to church the next morning. Don't remember what the sermon was about, but I just called out to God and surrender and said, I don't know what your way of living is, but mine is not working. And so whatever your way is, we'll try it. And just had this sense of peace come over me, and this, just had this really transformative spiritual experience. And so that was the, the turning point, the, somewhat classic born again experience.
Yeah.
And that, that was, up until that point, there was no thought on my part that I might go into academic biblical studies or something like that. And I didn't have immediately think, oh, I'm going to become an academic and study this. But that was what got me asking, okay, so what happens now and what does this mean? And what should this, where does my journey take me from here?
That's cool. And then you presumably started studying the Bible at some point. Did you go through a crisis of some sort once you maybe realized the Bible wasn't quite what you thought, or how did that happen?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Pentecostals are not as not as it's not that they can't be absolutely dogmatic. I mean, you look at the connection between Pentecostalism and contemporary Christian nationalism, and there's all kinds of things there.
Cool.
But doctrine is less of the core. Right?
Fair, yeah, more experiential. Right?
It's much more experiential, and so that certainly meant that between that and coming to it in my teenage years and being told once I started getting in with eventually landed the Baptist tradition. For those who may not know where the story has taken me, but falling in with Baptists and others who had much more emphasis on Bible and doctrine, but who said that the Bible is the ultimate authority. Right? If somebody was saying something like Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and then you read a textbook and pointing out that the author mentions all these kings reigned in Edom before any king reigned in Israel, and so it knows that kings reigned in Israel, and so it's clearly written later than Moses' time. Then it's like, why would I insist that Moses wrote this if the Bible is the ultimate authority? Right? And so one thing that was really helpful and meant I didn't spend too long trying to affirm something like inerrancy was the fact that I eventually realized that I was defending a doctrine about the Bible from the Bible itself. And so the Bible, when it presented, let's say, two accounts that didn't fit together, if the Bible is the ultimate authority, why do I allow a doctrine about the Bible to come in and say the Bible is not allowed to say these two different things? It has to say one thing. And then I put together a story that's not what either Matthew or Luke says about the infancy of Jesus. It's a combination of the two that you don't find anywhere, but it emerges out of the attempt to harmonize them. And so I think it was very helpful for me that I came that route, because I was able to see that the inerrantist enterprise is not, it pays lip service to the Bible, but actually it keeps the Bible, in a cage and in a straitjacket, and is really at odds with the Bible being heard in its own voice. And one of the reasons why I just love biblical studies and find it enriches my faith when I approach it this way is precisely that these texts are so much more interesting than what I thought they were when I was approaching them as if they were pieces of a puzzle that you have to put together in order to create your systematic theology.
Yeah, right. One thing I can imagine, though, like I get a lot of pushback on this because I talk about there's just so much when I study the Christian tradition. I'm willing to ask a question like, maybe Jesus didn't say anything that we have in the Gospels, or maybe, so I think a lot of people understandably can see a big tension, even if you're not a biblical inerrantist or, a fundamentalist of some stripe. It's just like, well, what do you believe then? It always kind of comes back to that. And for me, the thing that happened when I studied religion, I tell this story a lot on my channel, but I studied religious studies, and as I was looking at religious studies, I came to eventually see well, this is just a human thing. This is what humans do, and this is what my branch of humanity has done. Is Christianity is our way of understanding the sacred, the metaphysical, the way to live life. More importantly, the ritual, all those aspects of human life. And for me, the idea that I might not be able to believe X about the way that the Trinity is formulated somewhere that I can't see, but it's I still get a lot of nourishment from this tradition. It means a lot to me. It helps me, in the teachings of Jesus. It's really hard not to get behind those, whether they're the historical Jesus or later interpolations. But was it kind of a similar thing? Where did you end up if people are well, James, you have to believe X to be a Christian or else you're not? Or what? How do you kind of approach the faith now?
Yeah, so I think the sort of short general answer to that is that most of the things that people put on their list of essentials, other than actually trying to follow Jesus, most of the things that people put on their list of essentials are things that we have good historical reason to conclude that the very earliest followers of Jesus did not subscribe to, either because they simply didn't, or because the elaborated forms of thinking about these concepts were not there yet. And so it's striking to me that Paul uses Abraham as the example of faith. And so if Paul's talking about faith is what we're supposed to go to, it's so influential on the Protestant Reformation, for instance, if that's supposed to shape our thinking about this as Christians, right? Abraham's faith can't mean he subscribed to the Trinity. He believed in Jesus as the atoning sacrifice for his sins, right? He's not aware of any of that, right? And so faith has to mean sort of this attitude of trust in God. And what's exciting is that when you define faith in that way, and Paul Tillich is sort of major theologian who explored that, and it's worth reading, with Dynamics of Faith. But when you approach faith in that way, then the quest for understanding is a natural expression of faith. And nothing that you discover questing for truth is at odds with that faith. There's nothing. There are things that as I think about this, we talked about the fact that there are a lot of people who treat it as a binary, right? You're either a fundamentalist Christian or an atheist. Richard Dawkins famously adding a couple of other options in the interest of getting back to the binary, said that pantheism is just sexed up atheism, and deism is just watered down theism. And my response to that has long been, if you have a choice between atheism and sexed up atheism, why would you choose atheism, right? I mean, choose the sexed up atheism, right?
So much.
And so, right? So, I mean, I think that, people don't, I mean, if you say, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then I'd become an atheist. Why not Jewish?
Yeah.
Why does if the resurrection is not true, does that mean the same God doesn't exist? Why not Buddhist, right? Why not, every single thing, we tend to lump them all together and say it all stands or falls together, but it doesn't, right? And so you can be a follower of Jesus and not think that this, that, or the other thing that you have in one of these humanly written documents about Jesus gives us historical information. And there's really nothing inherently incompatible there. There are things that, if I were to have a time machine and go back in time and see them, might change my view of Jesus to such an extent that I would no longer consider myself a Christian, right? And I do not think, the evidence is not pointing me in that direction, but it's theoretically possible, right? And if we're being honest, then we should be open to that. And then, maybe take some comfort in the fact that as much as I'm a huge Doctor Who fan, as a lot of people know, time travel of that sort is probably not possible, right? But if there are things that would challenge my beliefs in such a way that I might no longer then define myself as a Christian. But one of the things that I realized, thinking through this as a thought experiment, is that my faith is something much deeper than that. Right. It's ultimately about God as sort of transcendent ultimate reality. It's about meaning, and that would survive even if it could be shown that nothing in the Gospels is historically factual.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I think as we're recording this, I have a video that's doing quite well on my YouTube, and it talks about what I learned about the Bible in seminary that made me lose my faith, and then at the end I kind of talk about why I came back, for all the reasons I just said. But one thing that's always scary to me is to go read those comments, and I try not to too much, because it's inevitably going to be hundreds of people telling me why my Christianity doesn't count, like water it down or what. But I think there's a lot of us, like, coming back to this deconstruction thing, and as you say, like, we don't talk about this enough. And I think maybe I don't know. This is a bigger question, but, like, is the onus on people who study the Bible to be gentle and kind of have these conversations? I don't know, but I think for at least those of us who have gone through this, and many biblical scholars have gone through some form of what is now called deconstruction, as you said. We know what it feels like. We know what it feels like to have that confusion and the puzzling and the questions and the where do I stand now and the how do I rework this. So I guess I'm curious as to like what your advice would be to somebody going through this, and who's probably, a lot of people will say like, well, I questioned X and now my friends say I'm not a Christian. My family says I'm not a Christian. My wife wants to leave me. Like all of these really hard, heavy human things that we don't really think much about when we throw things out about the synoptic problem or something, but these do have real ramifications in people's lives, I think. That's a long question, but what would you say to that person?
Yeah. So one of the wonderful events and sort of gatherings, community things, which I highly recommend to you and your listeners, for those who want to explore Christian faith. I think
you might need to put your mic back down.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I muted myself because I had a sip of water and forgot it was up there. Yeah. So one event that I've connected with and have been speaking at and attending that I recommend to you and other listeners if they want to see what an alternative sort of approach to faith can look like, with really, really large numbers of people gathered. It's like a liberal, open megachurch experience kind of thing in a very strange sort of way, but with a lot of geekiness involved. It's called Theology Beer Camp. And I think the person who came up with this, Trip Fuller, I mean, there is beer.
Is that Trip Fuller?
Yeah. But I think the beer is in there partly because if you call something Theology Camp, there are certain people who will show up who, if you add beer to the title, they'll self-select out. And then the rest of us can have this, do this exploring and have this, open. But yeah, this year, for the first time, my son came last year. We did some musical stuff there. But this year he's coming and we're both presenting together. It's been pointed out, I've been thinking about it already, but then it was sort of the theme was clinched when my wife said that I had indoctrinated our son into the love of Star Wars. But I think there's this interesting question of, how we pass on what we love and what's important to us. And that's true both in fandom and in faith. Yeah. And so I want to explore that because one of the key questions is the one that I wrestled with as a parent. And that's, I think, central to what you were asking me. Is it possible to pass this along in a way that doesn't oversimplify and get sort of our children on the path to a sort of a fundamentalism and an oversimplified approach to things that will then cause them to have a crisis of faith, right? And that will actually get them trying not to grow and mature in the way that ultimately is in their sort of spiritual best interest. And I think on the one hand, the conclusion I've come to, and I'm looking forward to, I've already had some discussions preliminary to this with my son, just to find out what his perspective on his experience was and how well I did. But I think that, on the one hand, when we tell stories to children, whether they are fictional stories or stories where we believe that, they are things that really happen, or, if, as an academic who studies the Bible might say, some of this happened, right? And it may be a combination of things that are factual with some things that are added on by one of the gospel authors. There's nothing, there is an age at which there's nothing we can do other than share the stories and sort of introduce them to aspects of it in an age-appropriate way. And when we grow, I mean, it's natural to lose something of our naive sort of love. I think it's Paul Ricoeur who talks about this, that when you approach something critically and see it that way, you can lose something of that naive love for it. And that's true in fandom as well, right? If you start noticing that, on the original series of Star Trek, for which there's, it's got a lot of really wonderful values that have stood the test of time, but oh my gosh, is there sexism, right? Mm. And oftentimes, the fans will either be like, I don't watch that show because it's, or will be like, well, no, you got to understand it as context. It's like, I think I've heard somebody say that about the Bible. Yeah. And so I think that it's possible to, do the critical thing and engage critically and still enjoy, right? And that's what Paul Ricoeur talks about, it's sort of second naivete, right? Of being able to say, I understand, I've taken it apart. I've seen how the sausage is made. I've seen what's under the hood and how the thing works, and I can still drive it, even though it's there's also this other way of approaching it. And so I think the challenge is that we set children up, we set new believers up with an oversimplification, but then we add on top of that an insistence that that's the way things are supposed to stay. Mm-hmm. You're not supposed to grow. You're not supposed to move beyond that.
Yeah.
And figuring out the way that should work in the dynamics of a community, where you're always going to have potentially new people coming in who are at a different point, is really challenging. I mean, I teach adult Sunday school at my church, so I'm involved in Crooked Creek Baptist Church in Indianapolis. And if anybody is looking for a place where you can go to a Sunday school class taught by a New Testament scholar, where really no questions are off limits, and where we're all readily open every single Sunday morning for the conversation to be derailed by a question, or what about this? Then come join us. But it's really challenging, right? Because there have been people who have started coming over the years, but there have also been people like from the church who came and then were like, yeah, this is not for me. I want someone to tell me stuff. I don't want to come in and we're talking and exploring, and it doesn't seem like we're drawing any conclusions. On the other hand, I have a number of retired and lay ministers in there, and even the pastor comes when he's able to. And so I love the fact that I, as an academic, could easily wander off and explore some things, and there's always somebody present who will say, okay, so what should we do with it? Like, how do we apply it? What is it good for? What's the takeaway?
Yeah.
How does this preach? Those kinds of questions. And I think they do, right?
Yeah.
I think that when asked about for instance the doctrine of the Bible, think about the Bible as something human. I mean, that preaches, right? It's avoiding idolatry. It's avoiding taking this thing as the work of human hands and attributing to it attributes that belong to God alone, and then relying on it the way the Israelites relied on the golden calf, because having a God who is free and who can surprise us, and having to admit our own, and lean not on our own understanding, then, I mean, all these things that the Bible self-emphasizes, we make the Bible into something that stands at odds with that. And the problem is not the Bible, right? The problem is what people are claiming about the Bible, right? Gold is not inherently evil. So you make it into this thing that you treat as a reassurance. It's a reassuring substitute for God. That's viewed that way in the Exodus story.
Yeah, that's cool. I think the one thing I alluded to in this video I just made as well is that one of the things I had to kind of think about is that most of the like my deconstruction started in seminary. Like I was literally training to be a minister, and it wasn't because atheists got to me. It wasn't because like I was reading Richard Dawkins. It was because I was reading biblical scholars. And I think it's funny because I get people sending me emails for like, well, I don't know if I can believe this. I'm going to quit going to church. What do I do now? And I want to just be like, there are communities you can figure this out in. Like, maybe your church isn't the right place. I don't know. Maybe you should be looking for another church if you can't ask these questions, or you're being penalized, or you're being bullied for asking them, or whatever. But like any reasonable sized city in America or Canada, where I am, or probably most places in the world, will have some sort of church that you could find some community in, and somebody that if you went to and went up to somebody and the pastor or priest or something and said, I'm having a lot of questions. I think the Bible is wrong about a lot of things, who would probably say, yeah, me too, as opposed to like, get out. I just, you're kind of speaking to it as well, but I wish, the thing I want to tell people is like, go find a community to explore this stuff. And you don't need to sit in front of the internet yelling at YouTube. Like go explore it with people. Yeah.
So the book, Beyond Deconstruction, it's really trying to point people to the fact that there are these other ways of approaching faith. Emphasizing what you do, right? I mean, Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount is all about what you do. The Nicene Creed, doesn't mention what you do. And it's this, thing that has happened in the history of Christianity that's just fascinating, right? Where what we believe has become the focus over anything practical. But the last chapter is Faith That Connects. And it's about, finding your people, and the fact that, on the one hand, I've found online community to be rich and rewarding. I mean, as a blogger, I would go to conferences, and I already knew people, right? We felt like we were already connected. We were already friends, right? And this was the first time we're meeting in person. There are still things that can only be accomplished in person, right? I mean, if you care about like attempts to censor books in your local public library, the fact that you have 1,000 people who click like on your post about it is not going to make a difference. Whereas, a dozen people who show up to the local meeting will, right? And so I absolutely think that, connecting online is useful, and it's often a crucial first step, but it certainly shouldn't substitute. And I think you're right that, while they may be cautious, right? So the first time you say something, I don't think they'll be like, yeah, me too. At least in some churches, it depends on the kind of church, right? If it's one where the minister is appointed from outside, then they can be free to do that. In having settled in the Baptist tradition, right? If a pastor says something that alienates the congregation, they might be voted out, right, and lose their livelihood. So I think there are a lot of people who are in congregations who look up to a pastor as an authority and don't realize how afraid pastors are of their congregation.
That's right.
And how cautious they're being. And so the two reasons why they're not saying things that they say that they learned in seminary, because pretty much everyone covered this, right? Even if they went to a conservative seminary where it was argued against, still part of the coursework. But a lot of them have been to places that are much more mainstream. But part of why they're not saying it is that they're afraid that if somebody doesn't like it, that they could lose their job, right? If it's one of the big donors or one of the big loudmouths in the church. The other thing is that a lot of this stuff, like the stuff that we were talking about John the Baptist, when we had our conversation about that, there's only so much of that should go in a Sunday sermon, right?
That's fair, yeah.
I mean, you don't want to...
There's a place for academic conversations.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it belongs maybe in a Sunday school class, but most of the people who teach Sunday school have not been to seminary, have not done that. And so that was why, to mention another of my books, that was why I wrote the book A to Z of the New Testament, was, I lived in the UK, I studied there, and realized that there you could do an A-level, which is like the equivalent of American advanced placement exams. You could do an A-level in religious studies, and you'd cover the synoptic problem and differences in John's gospel and all this kind of stuff, source criticism, redaction criticism. And the assumption was that teenagers can cope with this, and yet you can spend decades in a church and never hear these things.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is that it's not good sermon material, and other people don't really have like the background to get into it. And so tried to write something that was an accessible sort of introduction to this, and that led to A to Z of the New Testament. So I think that particularly if you have voices that share your faith, maybe not lining up exactly where you are in this particular moment, but are part of your tradition broadly understood, who you can say, okay, they're Baptist, so I could probably read this and it would probably be okay. Our way of getting into this. But I don't think any of this, none of this has to be at odds with your faith. None of this has to undermine your faith. It probably will change your beliefs.
Yeah.
And if your faith is not in God, and your faith does not mean trusting God, but your faith is dogmatically insisting that doctrines that you subscribe to are true, that's something very different, right? And in fact, what that means is your faith is in your belief system. It's in your doctrines. And biblically speaking, that's not where your trust should be. Trusting in the Lord is coupled with not leaning on our own understanding. Recognizing that churches that subscribe to the same doctrine of inerrancy hold different doctrines, right? Because they're reading the same supposedly inerrant Bible and drawing different conclusions about it, should lead us to actually approach our faith with something else that is upheld as a Christian virtue and yet often is lacking in when it comes to theology and doctrine, namely humility.
There. Beautiful. Well, I think we'll leave it there, James. So thank you so much for taking the time to reflect on these things.
Oh, thank you, CJ. Just thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.
And we'll look forward to the book. I'll have you back on when it comes out and we can talk about it again. So that's great.
Sounds wonderful.
All right. Thanks.